I overheard my dad telling my brother, "Don't worry, we'll make your sister pay." I walked away and moved all my money that very night. What they didn't realize was, I thought I knew what betrayal felt like. I'd spent a lifetime watching my younger brother get everything handed to him while I fought for every single scrap. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the night I overheard my own father tell my brother, "Don't worry. We will make your sister pay for everything." My world didn't just shatter, it exploded into a million pieces. You see, I grew up in what looked like the perfect American family in a middle-class suburban neighborhood in Pennsylvania. My dad was an accountant, my mom worked retail. From the outside, we had it all: a two-story house, a manicured lawn, summer beach vacations. But inside those four walls, a very different story was playing out. As the firstborn, I was held to impossibly high standards. My parents expected straight A's, perfect behavior, and mature responsibility from the moment I could understand anything. An A-? Why wasn't it an A+? My father would ask. Second place in the science fair? Why couldn't you have worked harder for first? My mother would wonder aloud. It was relentless. Then came James, my brother, 5 years younger. From the day they brought him home, it was glaringly obvious he'd be treated differently. My room had plain white furniture. James got a custom-painted race car bed and walls covered in expensive decals. My gifts were practical things like clothes and books. James? He unwrapped the latest video games, expensive toys, and gadgets. "Your brother is still little," my mom would always say. "Boys need more encouragement," my dad would add. As if being a girl somehow made me inherently tougher, more resilient to disappointment and neglect. It infuriated me. By the time I was 10, I was responsible for washing dishes, helping with laundry, and keeping my room spotless. James, on the other hand, left a trail of toys and snack wrappers everywhere, completely without consequence. "Just pick up after him," my mom would sigh when I complained. "He's just being a boy." At 12, babysitting duties were added to my plate. I became the unpaid caretaker whenever my parents went out. "You're so mature for your age," they'd say, as if it were a compliment instead of a burden they'd forced on me. One Christmas, when I was 14, still stands out. I'd been asking for a laptop for school for months, researching affordable options, explaining how it would help my assignments. That morning, I unwrapped a secondhand laptop that barely functioned. 2 hours later, James tore open a brand new gaming computer that cost 3 times what I'd asked for. "Your brother needs it for his games," my dad explained, seeing my face. "Those games help with hand-eye coordination and problem-solving." What about my education? What about my needs? Those questions screamed in my head, but I knew the answers already. They didn't matter. At 16, I got my first job at a grocery store, working weekends and summers. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed my own money. I watched James get generous allowances for simply existing while I worked 20 hours a week just to afford the basics they freely gave him. "It builds character," my father said, patting me on the shoulder, as if he were doing me a favor by forcing me into early adulthood. High school only amplified the disparities. When I needed money for a school trip to Washington, D.C., my parents told me to use my savings. 6 months later, they paid for James to attend a 2-week computer camp that cost twice as much. "Your brother needs these opportunities for his future," my mother explained. My future, apparently, wasn't worth the same investment. This pattern continued through every birthday, every holiday, every milestone. James received celebration and rewards. I received expectations and responsibilities. My achievements were met with nods and quick acknowledgments. His mediocre accomplishments? Parties and expensive gifts. But what truly hurt wasn't the material differences, substantial as they were. It was the emotional investment my parents poured into James, leaving me to fend for myself. They attended every one of his soccer games, cheering loudly from the sidelines. They missed my honor society induction because something came up at work. They framed his participation certificates and middle school art projects, while my academic awards collected dust in a drawer. Through it all, I watched James transform from a spoiled child into an entitled teenager. He expected things to be done for him, threw tantrums when told no, and developed a concerning lack of empathy. By 18, he could barely do his own laundry or cook a simple meal. My parents just laughed it off as typical boy behavior and continued to coddle him. Meanwhile, I retreated. I built walls around my heart, focusing on the one thing I could control, my own future. I studied harder than anyone, joined every academic club, and worked those grocery store shifts with fierce determination, saving every single dollar. "Why do you always have to be so serious?" my mother would ask when I declined family movie nights to study. "You'll miss these years when they're gone," my father would comment when I chose work over family gatherings. They never understood. I had already missed out on the family experience they'd freely given to James. I wasn't their child in the way he was. I was their responsibility, their helper, their backup plan, never their priority. By the time I graduated high school as valedictorian, I had accepted that my success would always be seen as expected, never exceptional. As I stood at the podium, delivering my speech about perseverance and hard work, I looked out at my family. My parents were there, of course, but I caught them nudging James to pay attention rather than watching me with pride. That night, amidst the congratulations from relatives, I made a silent promise to myself. I would build a life so successful, so undeniably impressive, that even they would have to acknowledge my worth. Not because I still craved their approval, but because I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't the afterthought they'd made me feel like for 18 years. Little did I know, this decision would lead to the most painful betrayal of all, and ultimately, to my freedom. The summer after graduation was a blur of grocery store shifts and college preparations. I'd been accepted to a respected state university with a partial academic scholarship covering about 40% of tuition. It was a proud achievement, but it still left a huge financial gap. "We need to talk about college," my father said one evening in July, calling me into his home office. My mother sat beside him, her expression carefully neutral. I knew this conversation was coming. For years, they'd made vague references to helping with my education. But sitting there, I watched them exchange glances before my father cleared his throat. "We've reviewed our finances," he began, shuffling papers. "And we've determined that we cannot contribute to your college expenses." The words hit me like a physical blow, though I'd half expected them. What came next hurt even more. "We need to save for James's education," my mother added softly. "You know how prestigious those computer science programs are. They cost a fortune." James was still 3 years away from college, yet his education was already taking priority over mine. "I understand," I said, because what else could I say? Arguing would change nothing. Crying would only give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Instead, I asked practical questions about financial aid and student loans, taking notes as if this were a business meeting, not another parental betrayal. That night, I revised my budget spreadsheet and applied for every additional scholarship I could find. I also applied to 3 more part-time jobs near campus, knowing I'd need to work at least 20 hours weekly to afford books, housing, and the portion of tuition my scholarship didn't cover. By September, I had 2 jobs, 15 hours a week at the university library and weekend shifts at a coffee shop. Between classes, work, and studying, I averaged about 5 hours of sleep a night that first semester. My tiny dorm room became my sanctuary, the first space that was truly mine. My roommate, Alyssa, quickly became a friend, often expressing concern about my punishing schedule. "You can't keep this up for 4 years, she warned me one night when she found me studying at 3 a.m. after a closing shift. "Watch me," I replied, not looking up from my textbook. The exhaustion was real. I barely dragged myself out of bed some mornings, fell asleep with my face pressed against my laptop keyboard some nights. I caught every cold that circulated through the dorms that first winter, my immune system weakened by stress and lack of sleep. But I never missed a class, never turned in an assignment late, never failed an exam. And most importantly, I never asked my parents for a single dollar. They called occasionally, brief conversations that focused mostly on James's latest achievements. He'd made the varsity soccer team. He'd been selected for an advanced computer science program. He needed a new laptop for school projects. We just bought him the newest MacBook Pro, my mother shared during one call. It cost a small fortune, but your father says it's an investment in his future. I thought about my own ancient laptop, held together with duct tape, but said nothing. During my sophomore year, I declared a major in finance, discovering a genuine passion for the subject beyond its practical career prospects. Numbers made sense to me. Unlike people, models didn't play favorites or change the rules. There was clarity and fairness in finance that I'd never experienced in my family life. I excelled in my classes, earning the respect of professors who began to mentor me and recommend me for internships. The summer after my junior year, I landed a coveted internship at a financial firm in New York City. The position paid enough for a tiny sublet and allowed me to save a small amount. It was my first taste of the financial independence I craved. That internship changed everything. My performance impressed senior management enough that they offered me a full-time position upon graduation, with a starting salary that seemed astronomical to someone who had been counting pennies for years. When I called my parents to share the news, their response was predictably underwhelming. "That sounds nice, honey," my mother said. "Oh, before I forget, James got accepted to that computer science summer program at MIT. We're so proud of him." By the time I graduated magna cum laude with my finance degree, I had worked thousands of hours, taken out the minimum student loans possible, and secured a position that would allow me to repay those loans within 2 years if I lived frugally. At 22, I moved to New York City and began my career in earnest. My tiny studio apartment was a luxury compared to the shared dorm rooms and summer sublets I'd grown accustomed to. For the first time, I could buy groceries without checking prices on every item and occasionally treat myself to small indulgences like takeout coffee or a new book. I opened multiple savings accounts, each with specific goals: emergency fund, student loan repayment, future home down payment. Every paycheck was carefully allocated, with the majority going to savings rather than spending. The habits of frugality formed during college weren't easily broken. Even as my income grew, my hard work at the financial firm paid off quickly. I volunteered for challenging projects, worked longer hours than required, and consistently exceeded performance metrics. My first promotion came after 18 months, followed by another a year later. Each step up the corporate ladder meant increased responsibility, but also increased compensation and benefits. By 26, I had repaid my student loans in full, built a 6-month emergency fund, and begun investing aggressively for retirement. At 27, I had saved enough for a down payment on a small but well-located one-bedroom condo in Brooklyn. The day I signed those mortgage papers was perhaps the proudest moment of my life. I had a home that was truly mine, purchased with money I had earned through years of sacrifice and determination. Throughout these years, my relationship with my family remained distant but cordial. I called on birthdays and major holidays. I sent appropriate gifts. I visited Pennsylvania once or twice a year for brief, often awkward visits, where the conversation revolved around James and his pursuits. James had eventually gone to college, though not the prestigious computer science program my parents had anticipated. After mediocre high school grades, he had settled for the same state university I had attended, though with the full financial support of my parents. From what I gathered during those stilted family conversations, he changed majors 3 times, took 5 years to graduate with a general business degree, and moved back home afterward, ostensibly to figure out his next steps. At 28, I had built the independent life I had promised myself as a teenager. I had financial security, career success, a home of my own, and a small but loyal circle of friends who had become my chosen family. I had proven to myself that I could survive and thrive without the support that had been so freely given to my brother. And then came that fateful weekend visit home that would change everything. It was my mother's 55th birthday that brought me back to Pennsylvania that April weekend. Despite our complicated relationship, I had never missed acknowledging her birthday. This year, I decided to make the trip partly out of obligation, partly because it had been nearly 8 months since my last visit. I arrived Friday evening with an expensive handbag my mother had been hinting about for months, elegantly wrapped with a card expressing more warmth than I typically felt. My father greeted me with his usual distant politeness, offering a brief side hug before returning to the baseball game on television. "Samantha, you finally made it," my mother said, accepting the gift with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "James has been here since Thursday." Of course he had. James, now 23, still lived at home despite graduating college the previous year. He emerged from the kitchen with a beer in hand, looking virtually unchanged from my last visit. His designer clothes and new smartwatch suggested he wasn't struggling financially despite his lack of steady employment. "The corporate drone returns," he said by way of greeting, smirking slightly. "How's life in the big city?" "Busy, but good," I replied neutrally, having learned long ago that sharing details of my success only led to uncomfortable silences or quick changes of subject. Dinner that evening was a familiar exercise in discussing James's life and achievements, meager as they were. He had applied for a few tech positions, but was being selective. He had joined a recreational soccer league. He was considering taking a coding boot camp that would really launch his career. "The program costs $12,000, my mother mentioned. "But your father, and I think it's a worthwhile investment." I nodded and took another bite of lasagna, thinking about how they had balked at contributing even a fraction of that amount to my college education. After dinner, James disappeared to meet friends, while I helped my mother clean up. We made small talk about her friends, her garden club, the neighbor's new renovation project. It was the superficial conversation of acquaintances, not the intimate discussion of mother and daughter. "We'll celebrate properly tomorrow," she said. "I have reservations at Giovanni's for 6 o'clock. Giovanni's was the most expensive restaurant in town, reserved for truly special occasions. I nodded again, knowing I'd be expected to contribute significantly to the bill, despite the fact that my parents had made the reservation. By 10:30, the house was quiet. My parents had retired, and I was settled in my childhood room, now converted to a generic guest room with all traces of my adolescence removed. James hadn't returned. Unable to sleep, I decided to go downstairs for a glass of water. The house was dark as I quietly made my way down the stairs, careful to avoid the third step that always creaked. As I approached the kitchen, I heard the front door open and close softly, followed by hushed voices. James had returned, and it seemed my father had gotten up to speak with him. I froze in the hallway, not wanting to interrupt what sounded like a serious conversation. I was about to turn back when I heard my name mentioned. "Samantha doesn't need to know," my father was saying, his voice low but clear in the quiet house. "This stays between us." I should have walked away then. Some part of me knew that whatever I was about to hear would change things irrevocably. But I remained rooted to the spot, hidden in the shadows of the hallway. "How bad is it?" my father asked. James sighed heavily. "About $40,000 now. The online poker sites, the credit cards. It all added up faster than I realized." My breath caught in my throat. $40,000 in debt? How had he managed that while living rent-free with our parents? "Christ, James," my father muttered. "Your mother can't know the full amount. She thinks it's half that." I know," James replied, his voice taking on the wheedling tone I recognized from childhood when he wanted to avoid consequences. "I messed up, Dad, but I've learned my lesson. I swear." There was a long pause before my father spoke again. "Listen, don't worry. We will make your sister pay for everything." The words hit me like a physical blow. I pressed myself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. "Samantha?" James asked, sounding confused, but not opposed. "How?" "She has that fancy job in New York, that condo. She has money," my father continued. "And she owes this family after all we've done for her." All they had done for me? My mind reeled at the audacity of the statement. "We'll tell her we want to start a family business," my father explained, his voice taking on the confident tone he used when outlining a plan. "Something about investing in property or a franchise opportunity. Something that sounds legitimate enough that she'll want to be part of it." "You think she'll just give us $40,000? James sounded skeptical. "Not give. Invest," my father corrected. "We'll have her take out a loan in her name. With her credit score and income, she'll easily qualify. We'll promise her returns, partnership. Whatever it takes." I felt physically ill. They were planning to defraud me, to saddle me with debt, to bail out James from his gambling addiction and irresponsible spending. What if she asks to see business plans or wants to consult her financial advisors? James asked. My father chuckled. You know your sister, always so desperate for family approval. We'll tell her this is her chance to finally be part of something important with the family. That emotional angle will cloud her judgment. I heard footsteps on the stairs then, and my mother's voice joined the conversation. What are you two discussing so late? She asked, her tone suggesting she already knew. Just talking through the plan for Samantha, my father replied. Oh, my mother said, her voice dropping. Has James told you about the additional credit card? Yes, my father sounded resigned. $40,000 total. My mother sighed. Well, Samantha has an obligation to help her brother. Family helps family. She's done well for herself, and it's time she contributed back. Exactly, James agreed, his voice suddenly animated. She's always going on about her job and her condo. She can afford it. She'll be here all weekend, my father said. I'll bring up the business idea tomorrow after dinner. Plant the seed. We can work on her over the next few months. Have her sign the loan papers by summer. She always wants to feel included, James added with a laugh that made my skin crawl. She'll probably jump at the chance to finally be part of the family business. I had heard enough. Moving as silently as possible, I retreated up the stairs and back to the guest room, closing the door without a sound. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling as the full impact of what I had just heard washed over me. My family, the people who should have protected me, were instead plotting to use me, to burden me with debt, to rescue my brother from his self-created financial disaster. They were discussing it so casually, so confidently, as if my exploitation was their right. I thought of all the years I had worked multiple jobs, the nights I had gone to bed hungry to save money, the countless sacrifices I had made to build financial security for myself. And they planned to take it all away with one manipulative scheme. In that moment, something broke inside me. The last lingering hope that my family might someday see my worth, might someday treat me with the same care they had always shown James, vanished completely. As I sat in the dark room that no longer held any traces of my childhood, I knew with absolute certainty what I needed to do. I did not sleep that night. How could I, knowing what I now knew? Instead, I sat cross-legged on the guest room bed, my laptop open, and methodically worked through what needed to be done. My mind felt strangely calm, operating with a clarity that comes only in moments of crisis. The shock and hurt were there, lurking beneath the surface, but I pushed them aside to focus on protecting myself. First, I reviewed my financial situation. My savings were substantial, but spread across multiple accounts. My investments were doing well, but would incur penalties if liquidated early. My condo had built equity, but accessing it would require refinancing. I needed to ensure everything was secure and inaccessible to my family. Next, I considered the personal aspect. The finality of what I was about to do weighed heavily on me. This would not be a temporary distance or a cooling-off period. This would be a fundamental severing of family ties. Was I prepared for that? I thought about my childhood, the countless instances of favoritism, the dismissal of my achievements, the constant expectation that I would fend for myself while James received everything. I thought about college, working myself to exhaustion, while my parents funded James's education without question. I thought about all the birthdays and holidays where my gifts were practical afterthoughts, while James received exactly what he wanted. And now, the ultimate betrayal, planning to saddle me with debt to cover his gambling losses and extravagant spending, using my desire for family connection against me. Yes, I was prepared to cut ties. I had already been alone in all the ways that mattered for most of my life. I opened my bag and quietly gathered the few belongings I had brought for the weekend. I repacked my toiletries, folded my clothes, and zipped my suitcase without making a sound. I left my mother's birthday gift on the dresser. Despite everything, I would not take back a gift once given. On a hotel notepad I had brought from my last business trip, I wrote a brief note. Had an emergency at work. Had to return to New York immediately. Happy birthday, Mom. No apology, no elaboration. They would assume I had left in the morning, giving me valuable hours before they realized I was gone. Then I settled in to wait. I needed the house to be deeply asleep before I made my move. At 2:30 in the morning, I finally heard James return. His heavy footsteps passed my door, followed by the sound of his bedroom door closing and locking. By 3 a.m., the house was silent, except for my father's distant snoring. I picked up my suitcase, slipped my feet into my shoes, and eased the guest room door open. The hallway was dark, but I knew this house well enough to navigate without light. I crept down the stairs, avoiding the creaky third step, and made my way to the front door. For a moment, I paused in the entryway, looking back at the darkened house that had never truly been a home to me. This would likely be the last time I stood here. The thought brought no sadness, only a sense of long overdue liberation. I slipped out the front door, closing it gently behind me. My rental car was parked in the driveway, and I thanked my earlier self for choosing to rent a car rather than letting my parents pick me up from the airport as they had offered. The night was cool and clear as I drove away from my childhood home for the final time. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. I checked into an airport hotel 20 minutes away, choosing a national chain where I could earn points. The night clerk barely looked up as he processed my information. By 4 a.m., I was finally in a clean, anonymous hotel room, ready to execute the next phase of my plan. I opened my laptop and logged into my primary bank account. I transferred most of the balance to a secondary account at a different bank, one my parents did not know existed. I left just enough in the primary account to avoid fees. Next, I called the 24-hour customer service line for my credit cards. I reported that I suspected potential fraud attempts might be made in my name and requested additional security measures. For my main card, I requested a complete freeze on new charges until further notice, claiming I had lost my wallet. This would result in a replacement card being sent to my New York address, making my current card unusable. I emailed my financial advisor requesting an urgent video call the following day to review my entire portfolio and increase security measures on all accounts. I was vague about the reasons, but emphasized the urgency. Then I composed an email to my boss, explaining that I needed to take Monday and possibly Tuesday as emergency personal days. I had ample vacation time saved, and my team could handle my projects for a few days. Finally, I searched for an attorney in New York who specialized in financial security and identity protection. I found a highly rated firm that offered weekend consultations and sent a detailed inquiry through their website. By the time I finished, morning light was filtering through the hotel curtains. I was exhausted but still too wired to sleep. I ordered room service breakfast and sat by the window watching the sunrise as I contemplated the new reality I had created overnight. My phone began buzzing around 9 o'clock. First a text from my mother asking where I had gone, then another, more concerned, then calls, first from her, then from my father. I silenced the notifications without reading or listening to their messages. Around 11 o'clock, I checked out of the hotel and headed to the airport. I had changed my flight to the earliest available, paying the change fee without hesitation. As I waited at the gate, I finally allowed myself to process what had happened. The hurt was profound, a physical ache in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. Not because I had lost something I had, but because I had finally accepted I never had it to begin with. My family had never seen me as someone to love and protect, only as a resource to exploit. I boarded my flight to New York with a strange mix of grief and determination. By the time the plane touched down, I had made peace with my decision. I would protect myself because no one else ever had. As I unlocked the door to my condo that evening, I felt a profound sense of homecoming. This space, purchased with my own hard-earned money, represented everything I had built for myself, despite my family's lack of support. I dropped my suitcase in the entryway and moved through the familiar rooms, touching furniture and belongings that were truly mine. Then I opened all the windows, letting the cool evening air sweep through the space, symbolically clearing out the last vestiges of my family's toxic influence. Tomorrow would bring practical challenges, meetings with financial advisors and attorneys, security measures to implement, a new life to build. But tonight, in the safety of my own home, I allowed myself to feel the full range of emotions I had been suppressing. I cried for the little girl who had never been enough. I cried for the teenager who had worked herself to exhaustion trying to earn love that should have been freely given. I cried for the young woman who had achieved remarkable success only to have her family view it as an opportunity for exploitation. And then, as the tears subsided, I felt something unexpected: relief. The constant effort of seeking approval from people incapable of giving it had been exhausting. Now that I knew the truth beyond any doubt, I could finally stop trying. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in years, my subconscious recognizing before my waking mind that I had finally freed myself from a lifetime of emotional debt. Sunday morning brought 27 missed calls and 43 text messages from my family. I scrolled through them without reading, then deleted the entire conversation thread. I needed clarity and distance to execute my plan, and their words would only cloud my judgment with emotion. My father had also sent 3 emails, the subject lines growing increasingly urgent. Where are you? Family emergency discussion needed, and finally, call home immediately. I deleted those 2. By noon, I had spoken with my financial advisor, who was alarmed by my situation and immediately recommended additional security measures for all my accounts. We set up verbal passwords, removed my parents as emergency contacts, and discussed the possibility of placing a freeze on my credit to prevent unauthorized loans being taken out in my name. This is unfortunately more common than you might think, she told me. Family financial exploitation accounts for billions in losses each year. You were right to act quickly. The attorney I had contacted responded and agreed to a video consultation that afternoon. She specialized in cases of family financial abuse and identity theft prevention. For 90 minutes, she outlined a comprehensive strategy to protect my assets and establish legal boundaries with my family. Document everything, she advised. Save any communications where they discuss this business opportunity. Record conversations if legal in your state. The more evidence you have of their intentions, the better protected you will be. She also recommended filing reports with financial institutions and credit bureaus, creating a paper trail that would make it difficult for anyone to open accounts or take loans in my name without extensive verification. By Sunday evening, I had implemented most of her recommendations and felt more secure in my financial position, but I knew the emotional confrontations still lay ahead. Monday morning, I took the personal day I had requested and continued securing my finances. I transferred investment accounts to new institutions, changed all my passwords, and set up 2-factor authentication on everything. I updated my will, removing my family members as beneficiaries and designating charitable organizations instead. At noon, my brother texted, "Mom is really upset. What the hell is wrong with you?" I did not respond. By Monday evening, the calls had escalated to include extended family. My Aunt Linda, my father's sister, left a voicemail expressing concern about my sudden disappearance and asking me to call her back. My cousin Michael sent a text asking if I was okay. I responded briefly to him, saying I was fine but dealing with a personal matter and would explain later. Tuesday morning, I returned to work, throwing myself into projects that required full concentration. My colleagues noticed my subdued mood, but I deflected questions with vague references to family stress. By the end of the day, I felt almost normal, the familiar routine of work providing a welcome distraction. That evening, I decided it was time to address the situation directly. I couldn't run forever, and I needed closure to fully move forward. I texted my parents, "I will call at 8 p.m. Please have James there too." At 8 o'clock sharp, I initiated a video call from my home office, a space that made me feel professional and in control. My parents appeared on screen immediately, their faces tight with anger and confusion. James joined a moment later, looking annoyed at being included. "Samantha, what on earth is going on?" my mother began. "You left without saying goodbye on my birthday weekend. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was when our guests arrived Saturday evening?" Of course. Her first concern was social embarrassment, not my well-being. "I had an emergency," I said evenly, not elaborating on the lie in my note. "You could have called," my father said. "We've been worried sick." I looked directly into the camera, my voice steady. I overheard your conversation with James Friday night. The silence that followed was confirmation enough. My father's face drained of color. James looked away from the camera. Only my mother seemed confused. What conversation? She asked. The one about James's $40,000 of gambling debt. The one where you planned to trick me into taking out a loan to pay it off. The one where you talked about manipulating my desire for family connection to get me to sign the papers. My mother's confusion gave way to shock as she turned to look at my father. Apparently, she had not been aware of the full extent of their plotting. We were just discussing options, my father began, his tone defensive. Nothing was decided. You said, don't worry, we will make your sister pay for everything, I countered. You called me a corporate drone with money to spare. You talked about me like I was an ATM, not your daughter. James finally spoke up. You were eavesdropping on a private conversation. Real mature. Interesting that your concern is my overhearing your plan rather than the fact that you were planning to defraud me, I replied coldly. No one was going to defraud you, my father insisted. We were going to propose a family business opportunity, something that would benefit everyone. Stop lying, I said. I heard everything. I know about the gambling debts, the credit cards, the plan to have me take out a loan in my name. I know you intended to manipulate me by using my desire for family approval against me. My mother began to cry. Whether from genuine distress or manipulation, I couldn't tell. Families help each other, she said between sobs. James made some mistakes, but he's still your brother. When has this family ever helped me? I asked. When I needed help with college, you told me to take out loans and work jobs. When I needed emotional support, you were too busy cheering for James. When I achieved success despite your lack of support, you saw it as an opportunity to exploit me. My father's expression hardened. You have always been selfish, Samantha. Always thinking about yourself instead of the family. I laughed without humor. That is rich coming from you. Let me make something perfectly clear. I will never give James a penny of my money. I will never co-sign a loan, invest in a fake family business, or financially entangle myself with any of you in any way. You ungrateful little, my father began, but I cut him off. I have secured all my accounts. I have consulted with attorneys. I have documented this conversation. If you attempt to access my finances or use my identity in any way, I will press charges without hesitation. James scoffed. Always so dramatic. I am not being dramatic. I am protecting myself from the people who should have protected me but instead saw me as a resource to exploit. What will people think when they hear how you have abandoned your family? My mother asked, her voice rising. What will we tell everyone? Tell them whatever you want, I replied. But know that if you spread lies about me, I will tell the truth about you. All of it. The lifelong favoritism, the financial neglect, and now this attempt to saddle me with debt to cover James's gambling addiction. You wouldn't dare, my father said. Try me, I challenged. I have nothing to lose. You made sure of that by never giving me the family support I deserved. The call descended into chaos, then, with James cursing, my father threatening, and my mother crying louder. I remained calm, watching their reactions with a detachment that surprised even me. This conversation is over, I said finally. Do not contact me again unless you are ready to apologize and accept that I will never provide financial assistance to any of you. I ended the call before they could respond, then sat in silence, processing what had just happened. I had said my piece. I had established boundaries. I had stood up for myself, perhaps for the first time in my life. My phone immediately began buzzing with calls and texts, but I ignored them all. Instead, I opened my laptop and wrote a detailed account of the conversation while it was fresh in my memory, saving it to the folder of documentation my attorney had advised me to maintain. Then I blocked my family's numbers and email addresses. It was a temporary measure, giving me space to breathe and think without their constant attempts to manipulate me. I could always unblock them later if circumstances changed. That night, I slept fitfully, my dreams filled with arguments and accusations. But when I woke the next morning, I felt stronger, more centered. The confrontation had been necessary, a lance to drain a festering wound that had been poisoning me for years. I was ready to begin healing. Within days of our confrontation, the fallout began. My father's sister, Aunt Linda, called to tell me how disappointed she was in my selfish behavior. My mother's brother wanted to know why I was abandoning the family during a difficult time. Cousins I had barely spoken to in years suddenly had strong opinions about my character and choices. It became clear that my parents had wasted no time spreading their version of events. Ungrateful daughter refuses to help brother in need, then cuts off all contact with loving family who had given her everything. At first, I attempted to explain my side briefly, but the responses made it clear that minds were already made up. Family loyalty ran deep, and few were interested in considering that the people they had known for decades might be capable of such manipulation. After a week of draining conversations that went nowhere, I decided on a different approach. I drafted a detailed email laying out the facts of my childhood, my self-funded education, and the conversation I had overheard. I did not embellish or exaggerate. The truth was damning enough. I sent this email only to the family members I truly cared about: my grandmother Rose, who had always shown me kindness; my cousin Rachel, who had been something of a friend during childhood summers; and my uncle David, my mother's younger brother, who had occasionally noticed and commented on the disparity in how my brother and I were treated. "I don't expect you to take sides," I wrote in closing. "I only ask that you consider there might be more to this story than what you have been told. I have removed myself from a harmful situation, and I hope you can respect that decision, even if you don't fully understand it." The responses surprised me. My grandmother called the next day, her voice shaking with emotion. "I always saw how they treated you differently," she admitted. "I said something to your mother once years ago, but she dismissed me. I should have been more persistent. I should have done more to protect you." Rachel replied with a simple message: "I believe you." She shared her own observations of family gatherings where James received attention and praise while my achievements were minimized or ignored. Uncle David's response was the most unexpected. He invited me to lunch and, over pasta at a quiet restaurant, revealed that he had recently cut contact with my mother for similar reasons. "Your mother and father have always had a blind spot when it comes to James," he said. "I'm not surprised it escalated to this. You did the right thing protecting yourself." These small validations were healing bright spots in what was otherwise a difficult period of adjustment. While I had been functionally independent from my family for years, the finality of this break brought unexpected waves of grief. Not for what I had lost, but for what I had never had: parents who protected rather than exploited me, who celebrated rather than utilized my success. At work, I threw myself into new projects, volunteering for challenges that required intense focus and long hours. My boss noticed my increased dedication and mistook it for ambition rather than distraction. "Whatever has lit this fire under you, I'm all for it," he said during our monthly review. "Your performance has been exceptional." The praise felt good, a reminder that in my professional life, hard work and integrity were recognized and rewarded in ways they never had been at home. In my personal life, I made a conscious effort to strengthen relationships with friends who had shown themselves to be trustworthy and supportive. I had always kept people at a certain distance, a habit formed from years of emotional self-protection. Now I allowed myself to be more vulnerable, sharing more of my true thoughts and feelings. Lisa, my closest friend since college, had always sensed there was something complicated about my family situation, even though I rarely discussed it. "I always thought it was strange how little you talked about them," she said when I finally shared the full story over dinner one night. "Now I understand why." 3 months after the confrontation, I decided I needed a complete change of environment. My company had an opening in their San Francisco office, and I applied for a transfer. The move would mean a lateral shift rather than a promotion, but the opportunity to build a life in a new city, thousands of miles from my past, was too appealing to ignore. When my transfer was approved, I sold my condo for a modest profit and prepared to relocate to the West Coast. The process of sorting through my belongings, deciding what to keep and what to discard, became a metaphor for the emotional work I was doing. Old mementos from my childhood and family went into a box that I stored rather than displayed. Not discarded completely, but no longer taking up space in my daily life. San Francisco offered a fresh start. I found a bright apartment with a view of the bay, joined a hiking club to explore my new surroundings, and established a routine that prioritized both professional growth and personal well-being. In my new city, I also found an unexpected resource, a support group for adults from dysfunctional families. The first meeting was uncomfortable, sitting in a circle with strangers, admitting aloud that the people who should have loved me most had instead seen me as a resource to exploit. But as others shared their stories, I recognized patterns and feelings that mirrored my own. The relief of being truly understood was profound. Week after week, I returned, gradually opening up more about my experiences and listening as others did the same. Through the group, I met Aiden, whose parents had remortgaged their house in his name without his knowledge, and Taylor, whose mother had systematically turned family members against her when she refused to continue funding her mother's extravagant lifestyle. Their stories were different from mine in details, but similar in essence: family members who viewed love as transactional, care as conditional. The hardest part, Taylor said during one session, is accepting that they will never be the parents you needed them to be. That no matter what you do, how successful you become, how perfectly you behave, they will never see you clearly or love you properly. Her words resonated deeply. I had spent decades trying to earn the love and approval that should have been freely given, believing that if I just worked harder, achieved more, proved my worth more convincingly, my parents would finally see me as they saw James. Accepting that this would never happen was both devastating and liberating. Around the 6-month mark of my new life in San Francisco, I received an email from my cousin Michael. "Thought you should know," he wrote. "James filed for bankruptcy last week. Your parents have been telling everyone they had to cash out their retirement accounts to help him." I felt a complex mix of emotions: vindication that the financial disaster I had narrowly avoided had indeed come to pass, sadness for my parents who had enabled James to the point of their own financial ruin, and a small, petty satisfaction that justice had been served. But mostly I felt grateful. Grateful that I had overheard that conversation. Grateful that I had acted quickly to protect myself. Grateful that I had found the courage to break free from the toxic family dynamic that had defined much of my life. 1 year after my move to San Francisco, I was promoted to team leader, managing a small group of financial analysts. My apartment had become a home, filled with plants, art I loved, and furniture chosen for comfort rather than status. I had made real friends, people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. On quiet evenings, I sometimes thought about my family and wondered how they were doing, not with longing or regret, but with the detached curiosity one might feel about distant acquaintances. They had shaped my early life for better and worse, but they no longer determined my happiness or defined my future. I had built something precious, a life entirely my own, free from exploitation and emotional manipulation. It had come at a high cost. But as I watched the sun set over the bay from my window, I knew without doubt that it had been worth it. 3 years passed with remarkable speed. My life in San Francisco developed its own rhythm and richness. I was promoted again, now managing a larger team and handling significant client relationships. My apartment, once a refuge, had become simply home, filled with memories of dinner parties with friends, quiet mornings with coffee and books, and the comfortable routines of a life well lived. I had dated casually, though I approached relationships with caution. The therapist I had begun seeing shortly after moving helped me recognize how my family experiences had shaped my attachment patterns, my tendency to give too much while expecting too little in return. Slowly, I learned to establish healthier boundaries, to recognize my own worth, and to expect reciprocity in relationships. My volunteer work became an unexpected source of fulfillment. Once a month, I taught financial literacy workshops for young women from disadvantaged backgrounds. Helping them understand money management, credit building, and investing gave me a sense of purpose beyond my career success. "You explain this stuff like someone who had to learn it the hard way," one participant told me after a session on predatory lending. "I did," I replied simply. The contact with my family remained minimal. My grandmother called on my birthday and holidays. Rachel and I exchanged occasional texts and met for coffee when I visited the East Coast for business. Uncle David sent Christmas cards with genuine, thoughtful notes inside. As for my parents and James, I heard news only through these limited family connections. My father had taken a second job after their retirement savings were depleted. My mother had sold most of her jewelry and designer handbags. James had moved to Florida after the bankruptcy, supposedly for a fresh start. I felt no pleasure in their struggles, but no responsibility for them either. The boundaries I had established remained firm, a necessary protection for my hard-won peace. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, an email appeared in my personal account that stopped me mid-sip of coffee, from jameswilson@mail.com. Subject: long overdue. The sender was my brother. I had not blocked his new email address when he changed it after moving. For several minutes, I simply stared at the notification, debating whether to delete it unread or satisfy my curiosity. Finally, I clicked. Samantha, I know you probably have no reason or desire to hear from me. I wouldn't blame you for deleting this without reading, but I hope you will give me 5 minutes of your time. I have been in therapy for the past year, dealing with my gambling addiction and the financial disaster I created. Part of my recovery process is making amends to people I have harmed. You are at the top of that list. What I tried to do to you is inexcusable. There is no justification for attempting to burden you with my debts or for the years of favoritism that preceded that betrayal. I was spoiled, entitled, and completely oblivious to my own privilege within our family dynamic. Since the bankruptcy, I have had to support myself for the first time. I work 2 jobs now, live in a tiny apartment with roommates, and am slowly rebuilding my credit, one payment at a time. In other words, I am finally living the reality you dealt with your entire life. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect a relationship. I simply wanted you to know that I recognize the harm I participated in, and I am genuinely sorry. James. I read the email 3 times, searching for manipulative undertones or hidden agendas. Finding none, I closed my laptop without responding and went to work, turning the message over in my mind throughout the day. That evening, I called my therapist for an emergency session. What do you want to do? She asked after I read her the email. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me thinks responding in any way reopens a door I closed for good reason. And the other part? I considered the question carefully. The other part wonders if people can truly change, if the brother who is willing to defraud me could become someone capable of genuine remorse. Those are both valid perspectives, she said. There is no right answer here. Only what feels right to you, and you don't have to decide immediately. I took her advice and gave myself time to process. For 2 weeks, I sat with the email, discussing it in therapy and with close friends whose judgment I trusted. In the end, I composed a brief reply. James, thank you for your email. I appreciate the apology and am glad to hear you are working on yourself. I need time to consider what, if any, relationship I might want to have with you in the future. Please respect that boundary. Samantha. His response came within hours. I completely understand. Take all the time you need. I am grateful you responded at all. 3 months later, after further consideration and therapy sessions, I agreed to a video call. The conversation was awkward but surprisingly civil. James looked different, the designer clothes and confident smirk replaced by a simple t-shirt and a more thoughtful expression. He told me about his recovery program, his modest job at a local tech company, and his struggle to establish financial independence. I shared limited information about my life in San Francisco, my career, and my volunteer work. We didn't discuss our parents much, though he mentioned they were still struggling financially and emotionally with the consequences of their choices. They still don't fully understand what they did wrong, he admitted. They see themselves as victims of circumstance rather than creators of their own problems. I nodded, unsurprised. Some people never develop that self-awareness. At the end of the call, we agreed to proceed cautiously. Monthly emails, perhaps another call in a few months. No promises, no expectations, just a tentative opening to see if something healthier might be possible between us as adults. I didn't know if this cautious reconnection would lead anywhere meaningful or if James's change was temporary or permanent. But I had learned enough about myself to know that I could establish boundaries and walk away again if necessary. The greatest lesson from this journey wasn't about family betrayal or financial self-protection, though those were important. It was about the power of creating my own definition of family, of surrounding myself with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. I had learned that sometimes walking away from toxic relationships, even blood relationships, is the only path to peace. That forgiveness, when it comes, is for your own healing rather than the other person's absolution. That establishing firm boundaries is not selfish, but necessary for well-being. Most importantly, I had learned that my worth was never dependent on my family's recognition of it, that the financial security I had built, the career I had established, the home I had created, and the relationships I had formed were all testament to my own strength and resilience. Sometimes, losing a family that was never truly yours is the only way to find the peace you deserve. And sometimes protecting yourself financially is the first step toward protecting yourself emotionally. As I finished the video call with James and closed my laptop, I felt neither elation nor dread, just a quiet certainty that whatever happened next, I would be okay. I had protected myself when no one else would. I had built a life worth living on my own terms, and that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all.